May I speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. On June the 28th, 1992, President François Mitterrand suddenly, unannounced and unexpected, made an appearance in Sarajevo. It was the center of the Balkan War, and before the end of the year, many would lose their lives. The object of his visit was to remind the world of the seriousness of the crisis. In the presence of a distinguished, elderly, visibly frail statesman, under small arms fire, made a significant impression on the world. Why did he choose that date? June the 28th, 1914, was the day that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and that unleashed on the world the horrors that we are gathered to remember and to reflect upon today. Hardly anyone realized the significance of the day. A few elderly people and some sort of serious historians realized, but the reality is that the historical memory was no longer alive. What are we doing? And what are we remembering today? Isaiah Berlin, the distinguished intellectual, philosopher, historian of ideas, had this to say: "I have lived through most of the 20th century without, I must add, suffering any personal hardship. I remember it only as the most terrible century in Western history." The most terrible century in Western history, the 20th century, from which most of us spring. In broad strokes, the 20th century began in 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke, and it ended in 1991 when the Soviet Empire collapsed. And that period can be divided into two. From 1914 until 1945, which was an age of catastrophe, and from 1945 to 1991, a golden age through which most of us here today lived and from which we have benefited. Let me look briefly at the age of catastrophe. To put it into context, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871 saw 150,000 French and Germans killed. In the First World War, Germany lost, and these are just men in uniform and women, 150 million killed. Great Britain, 800,000 killed. France, 1.6 million killed. Russia, 8.8 million killed. The United States, who came in late, lost 116,000. Overall, in the various wars, the numbers are hard to pin down, but a rough number is about 60 million killed between 1914 and 1945. Now, these are statistics, and we've been getting them on television until, 13.2% of this and 14.4% of that will mean that. And I'm aware that when I throw these figures out like raw meat, they're very difficult to digest. So let me just come a little closer. At the Battle of the Somme, 420,000 were killed. During the war, the First War, France lost 20% of its men of military age. And that does not take into account what they call the battered faces, the people damaged psychologically and otherwise. At Oxford and Cambridge, they lost a quarter of their students. And one of the most moving experiences I have ever had of remembrance was that some years ago I was back in Cambridge, and at King's College on Remembrance Sunday they had a service specially put together. And the focus of that service was to read from letters that were written by Kingsmen from the trenches during that war. What was particularly gripping was that the young men and women that were reading that day were the same age as the young men and women who had died and suffered in that war. And they were sitting in a chapel which would be unchanged virtually since those young men went off. And even the psalter that I had before me sitting in the choir stalls was one that was dated from 1780-something, beautifully leather-bound and large. That book would have been used by one of those. This brings it a little closer, but let me come just a little closer still. People who went to the First and the Second War were remarkably unwilling even to speak about it, because they had no way of properly explaining it. And even John McCrae, whose poem is on the back of our leaflet this morning, he speaks of it not so much personally, but it's sort of oblique. It's out there. The torch be yours to hold it high if you break faith, etc., and so forth. It's not personal in the immediate sense. Lester Pearson, Prime Minister of Canada, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, fought in the fleet, whatever, they didn't call it the Air Force then, it had another name, but that's what he flew, little double-wing fellows. And he was hospitalized from wounds. He did not say what those wounds were in his autobiography. But John English, when he wrote the biography of Pearson, went back to the records. What was Pearson suffering from? A partial loss of function of the nervous system. You're not talking about wimps. You're talking about the cream of the youth suffering from a loss of function of the nervous system. And lest we think it was just English and Germans and people like that who fought in this war, it was not. There were African, South African regiments, Indian regiments, regiments from throughout the empire, Australia, New Zealand. They all fought. And one of those who fought was a man called Norman Manley, not Michael, the senior Manley. And Norman Manley was the 100 yards record holder in Jamaica as a student. He won the Jamaica Scholarship, which was the prize scholarship that you could win so you could get to Oxford. He went to Oxford with a Rhodes Scholarship. And when the war started, Norman Manley and his brother signed up. Now, they were men of color. They had to join their regiment as privates. His brother was killed. And you'll never see a picture of Norman Manley throughout that long political and legal career without a black tie. And when that war was drawing to a close, he suffered from a partial loss and function of the nervous system. This is the cost. We can go on. Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of England, buried, he stayed under 3 or 4 corpses for 2 or 3 days. He had a book with him. He read Virgil in the original, waiting to be rescued. He was slightly wounded, but the scar remained. Lord Carrington, the elegant peer, foreign secretary, head of NATO. He was in the Battle of Arnhem, and he was in the lead tank corps of the Grenadier Guards that went all the way until that final step when they couldn't take it. And when he wrote his autobiography, he won the Military Cross. When he wrote his autobiography, he never mentions it. He was asked, why not, towards the end of his life? He said, oh, my contribution was insignificant. There was a huge loss of human life. And to come just a little closer, and I can't use his name because some of you here may know him, a man who flew bombers in the Second World War, right through the war, was shot down twice. He came back, he went to Harvard and got an MBA. He was a significant business leader in Canada and beyond. He never talked of the war, but the last 2 years of his life, he couldn't sleep because whenever he dropped off, he was back in the cockpit and he could smell the smoke, and he was struggling to get down, to get his men down so that nobody would be killed. You see, that sort of thing brings it a little closer to us, because these are not statistics, these are people. Siegfried Sassoon wrote this: they leave the trenches going over the top, masked with fear, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrist, and hope with furtive eyes and grappling fists flounders in need. Oh, Jesus, make it stop. In 1965, General Eisenhower was interviewed by Walter Cronkite at Colville-sur-la-Mer in Normandy, in a cemetery on the beaches, just off the beaches, where 9,000 Americans were buried. Gazing at the gravestones, Eisenhower explained to Cronkite, these people gave us a chance. They bought time for us so that we can do better than we have done before. So every time I come back to these beaches, or any day when I think about that day, 20 years ago now, I say once more, we must find some way to work for peace and to really gain an eternal peace for the world. But as we said, we're living in an age where the historical memory is frayed and faded. We have moved from that age of the 20th century, into a new, unpredictable, and at times very dark age. How do we do this? Now, there'll be people that will leave here, some of us watching, they will say, well, what did the preacher say this morning? Oh, a lot of statistics and history, and I'm not sure that I'm really all on that history stuff. And the reason is that remembering is usually thought of as something about the past. So let me be blunt. In the Bible, that is not so. I'll illustrate it. In Genesis, the word zahor, the Hebrew word for remember, God remembers 4 times in Genesis. The first time, he remembers Noah, and we're told he brings Noah and places him on dry land. You see, remembering in the Bible is not about the past. It's about the future. God remembered Noah, and he delivered him. The same thing with Abraham and Lot. God remembers Abraham. God remembers that Lot is his nephew. God remembers that they have a relationship, and he brings Lot out to give him hope for the future. And Rebekah is childless, and God gives her a child. He remembers. You see, when God remembers in Genesis, when God zahors, it's for the future. He's remembering so you can move on. So remembering is about the future. And if you come to the New Testament, if you come to the Gospels, every Sunday at the Eucharist, do this in remembrance of me. When the priest takes the bread and the wine and does this, breaks and shares, he's doing it in remembrance. You're not remembering, oh, Jesus must have been the most wonderful host. Look, he had such a bad weekend, and he was going off to get killed, but he wanted to have a farewell party with his friends. And the wine was good, the cooking was lovely, and it was a lovely party back there. But for everyone sitting here who comes to the Eucharist, enters into that moment, remembering is about the present, and remembering is about the future. And if we refuse to forget the past, we can change the future. What leads human beings to great crime, such as the crime that we have been reflecting on today? There are many reasons, but I think one thing is always present, and it's the idea of fear. People become fearful, and it leads to horrible deeds. And in times of great change and upheaval, such as the time in which we are living now, and which our forebears lived through in the last century, in times like that, a vacuum is created. And in the case of Germany, a maniac of ferocious genius stepped into that void. And he saw that people were afraid, and he preyed on it. And when you do that, the first thing you do is you find an object. Who are you afraid of? So you can project your fear onto someone else. And the first thing you do with that person is to dehumanize them. How the Jews were dehumanized. But it never ends there. Because when you're finished dehumanizing people, it's a lot easier to kill them. And that's what happens. Dehumanization. We are made in God's image. And I suppose if I say that, I'll just say, well, now remember that we're all in God's image, and it's absolutely true. But how does that move us? We are made in God's image. Our neighbor, the other, is like us in the image of God. And when I say this, am I being naive? I think not. I don't think President Eisenhower was naive. And to bring it a little more closely to our not just immediate history, but to our news, the news that we've been following, I bring you to John Lewis. You see, John Lewis, at some stage early in his life, he realized that black people were made in the image of God just like white people. And once you grasp that, and he moved off and joined the movement, he carried that with him. And once you have seized that as a cause and the center of your life, nobody can take it away. And so we know that in 1965, John Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Before he went, because he knew he was going to be beaten and locked up and everything else, in a hot summer day, he has on a raincoat because he's got some padding in there for when the blows come down and the dogs come out. And he has in his pocket a toothbrush and some toothpaste to maintain his dignity. And he was nearly killed. He was killed, nearly killed. Others were killed. He was killed because he believed that we were all made in God's image. He believed that the United States Constitution said that everyone had a right to vote, and he was marching for that right to be maintained. Come 50 years back now, and what happened? It was because of that right to vote that black people and white people and everybody, but especially the black community in places like Atlanta and other places like that, they came out to vote because they remembered what John Lewis had done for them. You see, remembering is not just about the past. Remembering is about the future. Remember.